Hello, this is the module on grief and loss. We do have an entire course on grief and loss, but we're dedicating one module to grief and loss and the applications of grief and loss theory and other theories to specific pastoral counseling locations. So we're going to talk about three things in this lecture. The first one is basic grief and loss theory, including regrets. The second thing is how one's belief systems and spirituality might come into play when we're talking about issues of grief and loss. And third, the areas in which counselors might find clients dealing with these issues, such as churches, hospitals, home visitation, elderly care facilities, hospitals, hospice, things like that. So let me just first talk a little bit about some of the implications of grief and loss. And the first thing we need to consider is that there's two types of anxieties that are related to this topic. The first one is for an individual who is nearing the end of life. And that's not grief and loss. That is death anxiety. Grief and loss has to do with the people who cared about the individual after they die. So we have death anxiety, which is fearing the loss of self. And we have grief and loss, and that is fearing or dealing with the loss of other. So the interesting thing is that when we talk about both of these issues, either the individual who's nearing the end of life or family members, friends, acquaintances that cared about the individual who have lost somebody and are experiencing grief and loss, a lot of the issues are similar, and a lot of the therapeutic techniques and theories are similar. So I think whether you're working with an individual in hospice or working with their family and loved ones, you're going to be dealing with a lot of similar issues. But there are some differences. So let's talk first about working with somebody who is nearing the end of their life. They might have had a serious injury, a health complication like a heart attack, cancer, some terminal illness, old age, so many different reasons why somebody might be experiencing this. But it's something that every human being does experience. So I think one of the things that we have to consider is no matter what the age, we need to consider Erickson's stage of ego integrity versus despair. And this has to do with the virtue of wisdom and the question, the existential question, is it okay to have been me? And one thing that every individual, if they have time, experiences is life reflection. So we do a life review. Does our life have meaning? And one thing that can complicate this process is despair. Excuse me. Despair normally is connected with some form of regret. And there's three types of regrets. two past-related regret and one future-related regret. Two types of past-related regret. The first type is a regret of commission. So I did something that I wish I hadn't done. I committed an action, a thought, had some experience I wish that I didn't do. So I might have had a harsh, angry argument with somebody. I might have done all kinds of things that I regret. The second type of past-related regret is a regret of omission. I wish I had done something that I did not do. So an example of a regret of omission is, I wish I had said I loved you more. I wish I had spent more time with you. I wish I hadn't spent so much time at work and more time with my family. Anything like that would be a regret of omission. A future-related regret has to do with hopes, plans, dreams that we all have of our future that may have been cut short or never accomplished. Seeing grandchildren, spending time after retirement, any of those things. Finishing a novel. So those are the three types of regrets. A lot of times, people get stuck in these past-related regrets. And we can't go back and change the past. But one thing that we do have to realize is that we're no longer the same person who made those mistakes. We have grown and changed, and we've learned from those mistakes. And we can help others through that experience. So even if somebody might have a year left in their life, that is a lot of time depending on how an individual spends that time. So I'm saying that because the more one experiences the presence, the less the length of time matters. But somebody who's experiencing regret is stuck in the past, in despair. Somebody who is experiencing a future-related regret is stuck in the future, experiencing anxiety. So the more we can help our clients to move into the present and to reconcile the regrets and despair, the more meaning they find in their present life. And one of the ways to do that is to help them accept the fact that we're all humans and we learn from our mistakes and we all make those mistakes. And if we can somehow both change our lives as a result of that learning process and live a different way, or help somebody else learn from our experiences, then meaning has been found through the negative mistakes. Another thing we could do is something from the 12-step program, and that is simply to express remorse, ask forgiveness, and hopefully acquire reconciliation. If there's time for that. Sometimes there's not. Sometimes the people we experience the regret with are no longer accessible for whatever reason. But that is an option. So let's say somebody does not have a lot of time left. They could be in a hospital bed, in a hospice situation, and they realize that. How can they gain meaning from this? Well, I allow them to provide meaning to my life. And I tell them that. And I said, as we talk about your life and your regrets, I am gaining knowledge, and through this experience with you, I learn, I grow, and my life has has more meaning. So even if they do not have the opportunity to live life outside of that hospital bed, they have shared their experience with me. I have grown from that experience of other. Hopefully we both have. And that will help to relieve their despair and regret, and reframe it into the present moment. Another interesting thing is if people have experienced grief and loss and it's been complicated in some way. So by complication, it usually has to do with some kind of regret. Perhaps they argued with the deceased, or did not spend enough time with them, or something like that, or will not get to spend the future with them. We can do a simple role play with them, and the client who's experiencing this regret in their grief and loss can do a role play with the therapist, and the therapist usually says, I'd like you to pretend that I am the person who just died that you have unfinished business with, and you're yourself, and you're sitting in two chairs facing each other, and I want you to express your regret or your anger and what's underneath your anger, or your frustration, or whatever it might be. And they express it, and I remember the language they used. Then I say, let's get up from our chairs, and I'll sit in your chair and you sit in my chair, and now I'm you, and you're the person you're experiencing grief and loss over. And you heard what you said. Imagine how they would respond to you. Now, 9 times out of 10, I make sure that it was some type of loving relationship. It wasn't an abusive relationship or something like that. And even then, this might help. But I do kind of screen the situation before I jump into this. So most of the time, deep down, the client knows that they cared for each other to some degree. So I say, okay, I'm you. You're that other person who's deceased. How would they respond to you? You know them better than anybody. How would they respond to you? And usually they express verbally out loud something like, I love you, care about you, you know that I forgive you. We're just humans. Humans argue, humans do all kinds of crazy stuff. And I always say, well, how would they like you to live your life now? And of course they say, well, I'd like you to live in the present, to be happy, to be successful, and not to dwell on these things, to know that I loved you. And then we change seats again. And normally what is affecting the client is these regrets have created a lot of negative self-talk. And the negative self-talk is usually self-blaming. So when they think about things, they usually are saying some negative self-talk to themselves in their mind. So I ask them to express this negative self-talk to me. And I remember the language that they use. Then I say, okay, I want you to imagine that I am your negative self-talk. I'm the negative you. And you're the new positive you. Because you know what this loved one would say. And you just heard it. You said it yourself. I want you to pick one of the most positive, empowering statements that you just said as your loved one. And every time I repeat the negative self-talk that you've expressed to you, I want you to refute it, to fight back. And so I say something negative, usually tell them, I don't believe this. This is your negative self-talk. I believe you're a good person. So when I repeat the negative self-talk that they've expressed, then I ask them to say something to fight back, to refute that. Something that they've gained from that role play. And then after we're done with that, we have a conversation, we process this role play. And I ask them, well, why don't you just find the most empowering one sentence and remember that? And every time you catch yourself experiencing this negative self-talk, you can repeat that statement. And that usually helps quite a bit. I do think that grief and loss groups create universality. Grief and loss groups, or even groups for people experiencing a terminal illness. Just knowing that you're not alone in this experience and sharing your experience with others. One of the most powerful things we can provide as pastoral counselors is to participate in their experience, to be present with them and for them in this most profound experience. This is life and death. And, this is one of the most profound experiences that human beings are given. And we often see death as a very negative thing. And it may sound strange, but I've had some very powerful, moving experiences surrounding the death experience. Just being there with people at this moment is extremely powerful. The conversations I've had with people are extremely meaningful, both with people who are dying and with their families who are grieving or experiencing complicated grieving. And I think one of the most powerful segments of the population that deal with this, that's often ignored, is children. Children experience grief and loss just as much as any adult, but they're often ignored, thinking that, oh, well, they could get over this. They're children. They don't really understand. Nobody really understands. But it's important that we give children the same amount of attention and time and presence as we give adults, so that they can experience healing and understanding as well. So let's talk about the spiritual aspect of both dying and grief and loss. Many times, anxiety related about the future, there's a lot of things with anxiety and grief and loss, including very normal things like, how do I make ends meet now financially? How do I take care of kids or family, or how do I take care of myself now that I'm alone? All kinds of questions, but anxiety related to the future without other, or if the individual's the one who's dying, what's going to happen? Or dealing with sadness and despair related to the past or complicated grieving. So a lot of times, people experience shame or guilt because of either the things we've done, the things we haven't done, things we've said. Often children talk about magical thinking. They wouldn't use those terms, but magical thinking is if we say something like, I wish you were dead. We don't mean that. And then something happens. And we believe that this was magical in some way, that we made this happen. And so there's a lot of guilt that individuals carry around. So we need to process that. But spiritually, this is a time when a lot of existential questions about belief and spirituality come up. A lot of times, individuals go through their lives not often thinking about the big questions: meaning in life, dealing with regrets, reconciliations, how we spend our time. Does our life have meaning? Shame, guilt. What do we really believe? Do I really have faith in a belief system? What do I believe is going to happen? And there's no right or wrong answer for a lot of these things. It's different for each individual. What's important is that we are present for that person in a very person-centered way. And we allow them to express these questions and process it with them. Create awareness. Promote this thoughtful process of investigation, of self-reflection, of inner questioning, and of discovery. And it's truly amazing when people begin to address these deeper questions of life, how they end up resolving them if they are just allowed to process them. And it's often difficult to process these things alone, or oftentimes people push these questions away because they are uncomfortable. They create anxiety at first, but if they are resolved, people can find peace, comfort, integrity, ego integrity. What I normally do is I ask people what their belief system is and where they are at in that belief system. So I want to understand where they're coming from first. So I ask them to just share that with me, and that will give us a starting point. So many times, individuals in any counseling situation, not just in grief and loss, want the therapist to provide the answers. And we can't do this, especially with a belief system and these bigger life questions. But what I can do is be with them through this process so that they know they're not alone, and to be present for them in these discussions. And sometimes the discussions are very brief, and sometimes they take months, and that's all relative to where an individual's at on this journey. But I think it's one of the most important things that therapists can do for a client, with a client. And it's been one of the most profound experiences of my life as a therapist, to be present with individuals during these times. I know this last part has been kind of vague. There's no one way. There's no answers in therapy either. This is what you do. But I think some of the most useful theories regarding this are person-centered, primarily. Gestalt can be used if people are stuck, if they find themselves at an impasse. Sometimes choice theory, but really a combination of person-centered and existential theory. If people have negative self-talk, you can always do CBT and REBT combined with Gestalt therapy. But I'd like to hear your reactions on this as well. I think most people have experienced some form of grief and loss, and if this is an interest of yours, there's a great need for therapists in this area. It's not a comforting type of therapy. It's not a type of therapy that a lot of counselors want to get into, but every counselor will have clients that are experiencing this, no matter what kind of therapist you are. Or you could specialize in this area if you feel a calling to do so. But I would encourage you to take the grief and loss class as well. And we go into much greater detail into grief and loss theory and all of its implications. All right, thank you.